The gold band slipped from Caroline's finger with surprising ease, as though her marriage had been nothing more than a temporary arrangement all along, and she pressed it into the ticket, Master's weathered palm with hands that refused to shake despite the enormity of what she was doing. "One ticket to Wyoming territory," she said, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "The station master in St." Louis examined the ring under the lamplight, turning it this way and that, his bushy eyebrows raised in silent question. It was April of 1876, and the spring air carried the scent of coal smoke and possibility through the open windows of the depot. "This'll get you there and then some," he said finally, sliding a ticket across the counter. "Train leaves in 20 minutes. You running from something, miss?" Caroline lifted her chin. "Running toward something, there's a difference." She had been Mrs. Caroline Hutchins for exactly 3 months, married to a Boston banker's son who turned out to have a fondness for laudanum, and a temper that emerged after dark like some terrible metamorphosis. The bruise on her ribs had finally faded to yellow, but the fear had not faded at all. So when she found the advertisement in the newspaper, carefully torn from the page and hidden in her late mother's Bible, something inside her had crystallized into pure determination. Her aunt, whom she had never met, owned a boarding house in Cheyenne and needed help. Caroline had written immediately, received an enthusiastic response, and made her plans in secret. She boarded the train with nothing but a carpetbag containing 2 dresses, a photograph of her parents, and her mother's pearls. The wedding ring had been the only thing of value she could claim as truly hers, a gift from her own modest inheritance. She refused to feel guilty about trading it away. That ring represented a future that would have killed her, slowly and surely. The train lurched forward, and Caroline watched St. Louis disappear behind her in a haze of steam and smoke. The other passengers in her car were a mix of families heading west for land, businessmen with calculating eyes, and a few women who might have been in similar circumstances to her own. She kept to herself, watching the landscape transform from settled farmland to wild prairie, feeling something loosen in her chest with every mile. 3 days later, she stepped off the train in Cheyenne into chaos. The platform was crowded with cowboys fresh off a cattle drive, their whoops and hollers filling the air as they celebrated reaching civilization. Freight wagons rattled past, kicking up dust that coated everything in a fine brown powder. Caroline clutched her bag and looked around for anyone who might be her Aunt Margaret, but the crowd was too thick and too rowdy. "Watch yourself, miss," a gruff voice said, and a hand on her elbow pulled her back just as a horse and rider thundered past, close enough that she felt the heat from the animal's body. Caroline turned to thank her rescuer and found herself looking up into the bluest eyes she had ever seen. They belonged to a man in his mid-20s, tall and lean in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle. His face was tanned dark by the sun, with the ghost of smile lines around those remarkable eyes, and his brown hair needed cutting. He wore dusty chaps over denim pants, a faded red shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. "Thank you," she managed, suddenly aware that he still held her elbow. He released her immediately, touching the brim of his hat. "Apologies, miss. Cattle drive just ended and the boys get a little enthusiastic. You waiting for someone?" "My aunt, Margaret Calloway." "She runs a boarding house." Recognition flickered across his face. "Miss Maggie's place, I know it well. I'm headed that direction myself, just need to collect my pay from the trail boss." "Would you like me to escort you? It's not far, but the town can be rough on ladies traveling alone." Caroline hesitated. She had just escaped one man, trusting another seemed foolish. But something about his open, honest expression and the respectful distance he maintained made her inclined to accept. Besides, She genuinely had no idea where to go, and the chaos around her was intensifying as more cowboys poured into the saloons lining the street. "I would appreciate that, thank you." "I'm Caroline Hutchins." The name still tasted wrong in her mouth, but it was the name on her ticket and the name her aunt expected. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Hutchins." "I'm James Ryder, but most folks call me Rye." He tipped his hat again, then gestured toward a building down the street. "Just give me 5 minutes to get my wages and I'll walk you over." She waited outside the stockyard office, watching the organized chaos of the cattle town at work. Men drove cattle into pens. Others loaded wagons with supplies, and everywhere there was noise and movement and life. It was so different from Boston, where everything had been constrained by propriety and social expectations. Here, things felt raw and real. Rye emerged looking satisfied, tucking a small leather pouch into his vest pocket. "All settled. Miss Maggie's place is just up this way." They walked together through the dusty streets, Rye keeping himself between her and the worst of the crowd. He pointed out landmarks as they went: the mercantile, the church, the doctor's office, speaking in an easy, comfortable way that required no response. Caroline found herself relaxing despite her exhaustion. "You're from back east," Rye observed as they turned down a quieter residential street. "What brings you all the way to Wyoming territory?" "A fresh start," Caroline said carefully. "My aunt needs help with her boarding house." He nodded as though that explained everything. Perhaps out here it did. "Miss Maggie's a fine woman. She took me in when I first came to Cheyenne 5 years ago, wet behind the ears and thinking I knew everything about cowboy life. She set me straight quick but kindly. You'll do well with her." The boarding house was a neat 2-story structure painted white with green shutters, a rarity in a town of weathered wood and false fronts. A woman was sweeping the porch, and she looked up as they approached. She was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and sharp eyes that took in everything at once. "James Ryder, is that you under all that trail dust?" she called out. "Yes, ma'am, and I brought you a delivery. This is Mrs. Caroline Hutchins." Margaret Calloway's face lit up with genuine joy. She dropped the broom and came down the steps with surprising speed, pulling Caroline into an embrace that smelled of lavender and fresh bread. "Oh, my dear girl, you made it. I've been watching for the train all day. Come in, you must be exhausted." Caroline felt something break inside her chest, some tight knot of fear and loneliness, and she had to blink back sudden tears. "Thank you, Aunt Margaret. I'm so grateful you agreed to take me in." "Nonsense. Family takes care of family, even family we've never properly met." Margaret pulled back to study her niece's face, and Caroline saw understanding flicker in those sharp eyes. Whatever Margaret saw there, she kept her observations to herself. "James, you'll stay for dinner, as thanks for seeing my niece safely here." "I wouldn't want to impose, Miss Maggie." "It's not an imposition when I'm inviting you. Besides, I made beef stew and there's enough to feed half the territory. 6 o'clock sharp. Now go get yourself cleaned up. You smell like cattle." Rye laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "Yes, ma'am, 6 o'clock." He touched his hat brim and smiled at Caroline. "Welcome to Cheyenne, Mrs. Hutchins. I hope it treats you well." Caroline watched him walk away, noting the easy confidence in his stride and the way several people called out greetings to him as he passed. Then Margaret was ushering her inside, into a clean, bright parlor that managed to feel homey despite the boarding house purpose. "Let me show you to your room, dear. You can rest before dinner. We'll have time to talk properly then." Margaret led her up a narrow staircase to a small room at the back of the house. It had a bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a window overlooking a small garden. It was simple and clean and entirely hers. Caroline set down her bag and sat on the bed, feeling the reality of her situation settle over her. She had done it. She had actually left. That evening, cleaned up and wearing her better dress, Caroline came downstairs to find the dining room table set for 3. The other boarders, Margaret explained, were all working men who took their evening meals at the saloons after long days of labor. Margaret preferred it that way, she said. Less cooking, less cleaning, and she could close up the kitchen by mid-afternoon. Rye arrived exactly at 6, transformed by a bath and clean clothes. He wore dark pants, a crisp white shirt, and a string tie, his damp hair combed back from his face. Without the trail dust, Caroline could see that he was even younger than she had first thought, probably only a year or two older than her own 22 years. He brought wildflowers, which he presented to Margaret with a courtly bow that made the older woman laugh. "Flattery will get you an extra helping of cobbler," Margaret said, putting the flowers in a mason jar on the table. Dinner was a revelation. Not the food, though that was excellent, but the conversation. Margaret and Rye talked easily about town events, people they knew, and the general state of Wyoming territory as it grew toward eventual statehood. They included Caroline naturally, asking her opinion, telling stories for her benefit, making her feel like part of something rather than an outsider. It was so different from the stiff, formal dinners of her marriage, where she had been expected to remain silent unless directly addressed. "So what's your plan, James?" Margaret asked as she served the promised cobbler. "Another cattle drive this summer?" "No, ma'am. I've saved enough to buy some land and start my own operation." "Nothing big, just a small ranch where I can raise horses. There's good money in horses if you breed them right, and it's steadier than waiting for cattle drives." "That sounds wonderful," Caroline said, then felt herself flush at the enthusiasm in her own voice. "I apologize, that's none of my business." "No apology needed," Rye said easily. "I'm excited about it myself. Been dreaming about having my own place since I was 16 and left my family's farm in Missouri. Figured if I was going to break my back working, it should be for myself, you know." Caroline knew exactly what he meant. The desire for autonomy, for control over one's own life, it was what had driven her west. "Where's the land?" "About 10 miles northeast of here. There's a good water source, decent grazing, and enough timber for building. I can start small, maybe a cabin and a corral, and build up from there." He paused, then added with a self-deprecating smile, "Of course, I don't know the first thing about building a cabin, so that might be interesting." "You'll figure it out," Margaret said confidently. "You always do. When do you plan to start?" "Soon as I can get the supplies together. Few weeks, maybe." The conversation drifted to other topics, and eventually Rye took his leave, thanking Margaret for the meal and nodding politely to Caroline. After he left, Margaret poured them both coffee and settled into her chair with a satisfied sigh. "That boy is going to do well for himself," she said. "He's got ambition and sense, a rare combination." "He seems very kind," Caroline offered carefully. "He is, and honest, which is even rarer. He's worked hard for everything he has, never asked for handouts or special treatment." Margaret paused, studying Caroline over the rim of her coffee cup. "Now, my dear, I think it's time you told me the real reason you're here, and don't spare my feelings. I may be old, but I'm not delicate." Caroline set down her own cup with trembling hands. She had not planned to tell anyone the truth, but something about Margaret's direct gaze and matter-of-fact tone made her want to be honest. So she told her everything. The whirlwind courtship, the marriage her father's business partner had encouraged, the horror of discovering her husband's true nature, and the desperate decision to flee. Margaret listened without interruption, her face growing grimmer as the story unfolded. When Caroline finished, the older woman reached across the table and gripped her hand. "You were brave to leave," Margaret said fiercely. "Some women stay and let it kill them, either fast or slow. You chose to live. I'm proud of you, Caroline." The words hit Caroline like a physical blow, but in the best possible way. She had expected judgment, criticism, or at least disappointment. Instead, she received approval and understanding. The tears she had been holding back since boarding the train finally spilled over. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." "Now the practical matters," Margaret said, releasing her hand and becoming brisk again. "Does your husband know where you've gone?" "I don't think so." "I told no one, and I used my mother's maiden name in my letter to you. He'll assume I went to my cousin in Philadelphia. That's where I said I was going when I left the house that morning." "Good." "If anyone comes asking, I've never heard of Caroline Hutchins. You'll need a new name, though. Can't have you jumping every time someone says it." Caroline had not thought that far ahead, but Margaret was right. She needed to become someone else, at least until she could figure out a more permanent solution. What about Caroline Ross? "Ross was my mother's name." "Perfect. Simple to remember, hard to trace. As far as anyone in Cheyenne knows, you're Caroline Ross, my niece from back east who's come to help me run the boarding house." Margaret stood and began clearing the dishes. "We'll start fresh tomorrow, Caroline Ross. Tonight you should rest. You look exhausted." Caroline did rest, falling into a deep, dreamless sleep in her small room at the back of the house. She woke to bright sunlight and the sound of birds in the garden, and for the first moment in months, she did not feel afraid. The next weeks fell into a comfortable pattern. Caroline learned the rhythms of running a boarding house, the cleaning and cooking and accounting that kept everything running smoothly. She met the other boarders, a mix of railroad workers, shop clerks, and one traveling salesman who was rarely there. She learned to navigate Cheyenne, finding her way to the mercantile, the post office, and the church where Margaret attended services on Sundays. She also saw Rye, more often than she expected. He stopped by regularly to check on Margaret, as he apparently always had, and his visits began to include longer conversations with Caroline. He told her about the progress on his land, how he had hired a couple of experienced builders to help with the cabin, how he had bought his first 3 horses. She told him about life in Boston, carefully editing out any mention of her marriage, and about her adjustment to Western life. "It's so different here," she said one afternoon as they sat on the porch shelling peas for Margaret. It was late May, and the weather had turned warm and pleasant. "Everything feels bigger. The sky, the land, even the possibilities." "That's what I love about it," Rye agreed. "Back in Missouri, everything was already decided. My older brothers would inherit the farm, I would work for them, and that was that. Out here, a man can make his own way." He paused, then added, "Or a woman, I suppose. There are some women homesteading on their own, running businesses. It's hard, but possible." Mrs. Hutchins was married, Margaret called from inside, apparently listening to their conversation. "But her husband passed last year. That's why she's free to help me." Caroline shot a grateful look toward the open door. Margaret had established that fiction early on, and it provided the perfect explanation for why Caroline wore no wedding ring and had no husband trailing behind her. "I'm sorry for your loss," Rye said quietly. "Thank you. It was very sudden." Caroline focused on the peas in her lap, hating the lie but knowing it was necessary. They worked in companionable silence for a while before Rye spoke again. "The cabin's nearly finished. I'm planning to move out there next week. I was wondering if you and Miss Maggie might like to come see it. I could use a woman's opinion on where to put things." "We would love to," Caroline said, surprised by how much she meant it. The following Sunday, Margaret borrowed a neighbor's wagon, and they drove out to Rye's property. The landscape was rolling grassland dotted with stands of cottonwood trees, with the mountains visible in the distance like blue shadows on the horizon. The cabin sat near a creek, a simple structure of logs chinked with mud, but solid and well built. There was a corral next to it, and 3 horses grazed peacefully nearby. "It's wonderful," Caroline said, and she meant it. The cabin represented everything she had been seeking when she left Boston: freedom, independence, and a future built on honest work rather than social obligation. Rye's face lit up with pride. "It's small, but it's mine. Come inside, I'll show you." The interior was rough but functional. One large room with a stone fireplace at one end, a sleeping area curtained off at the back, and space for a table and chairs. Rye had built shelves and a counter, and there was even a window looking out toward the creek. "You'll want curtains," Margaret said immediately, "and a proper rug. This floor will be cold come winter." "I was thinking the same thing," Rye admitted, "but I don't know the first thing about curtains." "I could make them," Caroline heard herself say. "If you buy the fabric, I could sew them for you." "Would you? That would be wonderful." They spent the afternoon at the ranch, Margaret dispensing advice while Caroline took measurements and Rye proudly showed off his horses. One was a gentle mare, one a spirited gelding, and the third a young stallion with excellent bloodlines that Rye planned to use for breeding. "They're beautiful," Caroline said, stroking the mare's soft nose. The horse whickered and leaned into her touch. "She likes you," Rye observed. "Horses are good judges of character." On the drive back to town, Margaret was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, as they approached Cheyenne, she said, "That young man is sweet on you, Caroline." "What? No, he's just being friendly." "I've known James Ryder for 5 years. He's friendly to everyone, but he doesn't look at everyone the way he looks at you. And before you start worrying, I think it's wonderful." "He's a good man, and you deserve someone good." Caroline did not know what to say. She had not let herself think about Rye in those terms, too afraid to even consider the possibility of trusting another man. But now that Margaret had said it aloud, she realized she had been feeling something beyond simple friendship. The way her heart lifted when he stopped by, the way she found herself watching for him, the warmth that spread through her when he smiled. "I'm not free to think about such things," she said finally. "I'm still married, legally if not in any way that matters." "You're a widow, remember?" Margaret said gently. "And even if you weren't, you're building a new life here. Part of that life can include happiness, Caroline. You're allowed to be happy." The idea was so foreign, so unexpected, that Caroline could not quite wrap her mind around it. But the seed was planted, and over the following weeks, it began to grow. She made the curtains, spending her evenings cutting and stitching the blue and white gingham fabric Rye had bought at her recommendation. When they were finished, Margaret declared they deserved a proper installation, so the three of them drove out to the ranch again. Caroline hung the curtains while Rye and Margaret moved furniture, and when everything was arranged to satisfaction, the cabin looked almost homey. "It needs a woman's touch permanently," Margaret said with studied casualness. "A bachelor ranch is a sad thing." Rye laughed but did not disagree. He had made lunch, bacon and beans and strong coffee, which they ate outside on a blanket near the creek. It was early June, the weather perfect, the grass green from spring rains and wildflowers blooming everywhere. Caroline felt something settle inside her, a sense of rightness she had not experienced in years. After lunch, Margaret declared she needed a nap and installed herself in the wagon with a blanket and her knitting. Caroline suspected this was a deliberate ploy to leave her and Rye alone, but she did not protest. They walked along the creek, Rye pointing out where he planned to plant a vegetable garden where he might build a barn eventually, where the property line ran. "I never thought I would love a place this much," he admitted, "but every morning I wake up here I feel like the luckiest man alive." "I understand that feeling," Caroline said. "When I first arrived in Cheyenne, when Margaret hugged me and welcomed me in, I felt like I could finally breathe again." "What were you running from?" Rye asked quietly. "I've never wanted to pry, but I can tell you left something bad behind." Caroline stopped walking and looked at the creek, at the clear water running over smooth stones. She had promised herself she would never tell anyone the full truth. But somehow, standing there in the Wyoming sunshine with this kind, honest man beside her, the promise seemed less important than the truth. "I was married," she said, and then the whole story came tumbling out. Her husband's addiction, his violence, her fear, and her desperate flight. She told Rye everything, her voice shaking but steady, and when she finished she turned to face him, braced for judgment or pity or disgust. Instead, she saw fury. "He hurt you," Rye said, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That coward hurt you." "Yes, but I got away. You should have killed him." The matter-of-fact way he said it startled a laugh from Caroline. "I considered it, but I chose freedom instead." Rye took a step closer, then stopped, visibly forcing himself to remain still. "Caroline, I need to tell you something, and I don't want you to feel pressured or uncomfortable. If you want me to stop visiting, I will, but I have to be honest with you." Caroline's heart began to pound. "What is it?" "I'm in love with you. I have been since the day I met you at the train station. I know it's too soon, I know you've been through hell, and I know I have no right to say anything. But I can't keep pretending I feel anything else. You're the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever met, and I would count myself the luckiest man alive if you would let me court you properly." The declaration hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Caroline stared at him, at his earnest face and hopeful eyes, and felt something crack open in her chest. Fear, yes, but also something else. Hope, possibility, the chance at something real and true and good. "I'm not free," she whispered. "Legally, I'm still married." "You're a widow named Caroline Ross, remember?" Rye took another step closer, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat. "And even if you weren't, I don't care. Whatever your past, whatever complications exist, we can work through them, together, if you want to." "I'm afraid," Caroline admitted. "I swore I would never trust another man." "I know. And I'm not asking you to trust me completely right now. I'm just asking you to give me a chance to earn it. Let me court you, Caroline. Let me show you that not all men are like him. And if at any point you want me to stop, I will. No questions, no arguments." Caroline thought about the months she had spent with Rye, the kindness he had shown her, the respect, the easy friendship. She thought about the way he made her laugh, the way he listened when she talked, the way he never tried to control or diminish her. She thought about the future stretching ahead, and for the first time she could imagine it including someone else, including him. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you can court me." Rye's face transformed with joy, and he reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and took her hand in his. His touch was gentle, reverent, nothing like the rough grabs she had learned to fear. "Thank you," he said. "I promise I'll make you happy, Caroline, I promise." They walked back to the wagon hand in hand, and if Margaret noticed, she had the good sense not to comment beyond a satisfied smile. The courtship was everything Caroline had never known she wanted. Rye was patient and respectful, always asking permission before taking her hand or sitting close, never pushing for more than she was willing to give. He brought her wildflowers and interesting rocks from his property. He took her on long walks and longer conversations. He made her laugh and made her think, and made her feel safe in a way she had not thought possible. Margaret watched it all with approval, chaperoning when propriety demanded but giving them space when she could. The other boarders noticed and teased Caroline good-naturedly about her cowboy. The town began to accept them as a couple, nodding knowingly when they saw them together. July brought scorching heat and the celebration of the nation's centennial. Cheyenne organized a huge celebration with speeches, music, and dancing in the street. Caroline wore her mother's pearls and her best dress, and Rye wore a new shirt he had bought specially for the occasion. They danced together under strings of lanterns, surrounded by townspeople and ranchers and every citizen in 50 miles. "I could do this forever," Rye said as they swayed to the music. Dance. Caroline asked, smiling up at him. Be with you, just be with you, whatever we're doing. That night, walking back to Margaret's in the cool darkness, Rye stopped in the middle of the street and turned to face her. Caroline Ross, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. I want to build a life with you, raise horses and a family, grow old watching sunsets from our porch. Will you marry me? Caroline's breath caught. She had known this was coming, had felt it building between them, but the reality of it still shocked her. Marriage. The word that had once meant fear and pain now felt full of promise. Yes, she said, and then louder with more certainty, yes, I'll marry you. Rye whooped and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. Then he set her down gently and kissed her, soft and sweet, a promise of all the kisses to come. But there was still the matter of her first marriage to resolve. That night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, Caroline wrestled with the problem. She could not marry Rye as Caroline Ross when Caroline Hutchins was still legally bound to another man. She needed to do something, but she did not know what. The next morning, she confided in Margaret. The older woman listened thoughtfully, then nodded decisively. We need a lawyer, someone discreet who can look into your options. I know just the man. Judge Porter's son practices law in town, and he's helped me with legal matters before. Let me arrange a meeting. 3 days later, Caroline sat in the small office of Henry Porter, attorney at law, and explained her situation. Porter was a young man, perhaps 30, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of competence. This is complicated, he admitted after she finished, but not impossible. Wyoming Territory has more progressive laws regarding women than many states. If we can establish that you were subject to cruelty, we may be able to petition for divorce without your husband's consent or presence. How long would that take? Months at minimum. Perhaps a year, and there's no guarantee of success, especially since your husband is in another state and may contest it. Caroline felt despair rising. A year was too long, too uncertain. Porter tapped his pen against his desk, thinking, there is another option. It's irregular but legal. If you can obtain affidavits from reliable witnesses attesting to your husband's violence and your fear for your safety, and if you can demonstrate that you've been living separately for a significant period with no hope of reconciliation, we might argue for an annulment based on fraud. The fraud being that your husband misrepresented his character and the marriage was entered into under false pretenses. Would that work? In Wyoming Territory, possibly. Judge Martin is sympathetic to women's causes, and he has broad discretion in territorial matters. It's worth attempting. Can you get those affidavits? Caroline thought of the neighbors who must have heard her crying, the doctor who had treated her injuries with knowing eyes, the maid who had helped her pack. I think so. But I would have to write to them, and I'm afraid of my husband finding out where I am. Write to them, care of my office. I'll ensure any responses come directly to me with no traceable connection to you. And Mrs. Ross, he added gently, I want you to know that what you're doing is brave. Many women in your situation simply suffer in silence. You're fighting back, and that deserves respect. Over the following weeks, Caroline wrote careful letters to the few people in Boston she thought might help her. She explained what she needed, why she needed it, and begged for their discretion. The waiting was agony, but Rye's steady presence made it bearable. She told him everything, and he listened with quiet fury tempered by understanding. However long it takes, I'll wait, he promised. We'll wait together. The responses began trickling in by late August. The neighbor had written a careful affidavit describing the sounds of violence she had heard through the walls. The doctor provided medical records documenting injuries inconsistent with Caroline's explanations. The maid, bless her, wrote a scathing account of her employer's behavior and his wife's terror. It was enough. Porter filed the petition in early September. Judge Martin reviewed the case, called Caroline in for a private interview where she answered questions with shaking voice but unwavering honesty, and rendered his decision within 2 weeks. The marriage was annulled. Caroline Hutchins had never legally existed as a married woman. She was free. When Porter delivered the news, Caroline sat in his office and cried, not from sadness but from pure relief. Years of weight she had not realized she was carrying lifted from her shoulders. She was free, truly, completely free. Rye was waiting outside the office, pacing anxiously. When Caroline emerged with tears streaming down her face but a smile on her lips, he did not wait for her to speak. He just pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried out all the fear and pain and relief. "It's over," she finally managed. "It's really over, I'm free." "You've always been free," Rye said fiercely. "He never owned you, Caroline, he never could." That night, Margaret made a celebratory dinner, inviting Porter and Judge Martin and a few other friends. They toasted Caroline's new beginning with apple cider, and the judge gave her a copy of the annulment decree, officially sealed and recorded. "Keep this safe," he advised. "It's your proof, should you ever need it." Caroline folded the document carefully and tucked it into her mother's Bible. She would keep it, but she would not need to look at it. That chapter of her life was closed. In October, with the aspens turning gold in the mountains and the air turning crisp, Rye raised the question of marriage again. They were at his ranch, now fully furnished and feeling like a real home, sitting on the porch and watching his small herd of horses graze. "I know we talked about getting married before," he said carefully, "but I want to make sure you're truly ready. There's no rush, Caroline. I'm not going anywhere." Caroline turned to look at him, this good, patient, wonderful man who had waited for her, supported her, and loved her without condition. "I'm ready," she said. "I'm more than ready. I want to marry you, Rye. I want to build that life we talked about." His smile could have lit the whole territory. "Then let's do it right. A proper wedding with your aunt and our friends in the church, with you in a beautiful dress. You deserve that, Caroline. You deserve everything." They set the date for November, giving Caroline time to make a dress and Rye time to finish the improvements he had been making to the cabin. Margaret took charge of the arrangements with the church and the reception, her organizational skills in full force. The whole town seemed invested in the wedding, with people Caroline barely knew offering congratulations and best wishes. 2 weeks before the wedding, Rye asked Caroline to come to the ranch. It was late afternoon, and the autumn light painted everything gold and amber. He led her to the top of a small rise where they could see the entire property spread out below them, the cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, the corrals with horses, the creek winding through the grass, and beyond it all, the mountains. "I wanted to do this properly," Rye said, reaching into his pocket. "I've been saving for this since the day you said yes to courting." He pulled out a small box and opened it. Inside was a ring, delicate gold with a small diamond that caught the sunset light and sparkled like a promise. "I know you traded away a wedding ring to come west," Rye said softly. "I want to give you a better one, not because it's fancier or worth more, but because it represents something true. A real partnership, a real love, a real future. Caroline Ross, will you marry me, here in front of God in these mountains, and be my wife for as long as we both shall live?" Caroline looked at the ring, at this man kneeling before her in the Wyoming sunset, at the life they were building together, and felt joy flood through her like warmth. "Yes," she said. 1,000 times yes. Rye slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he stood and kissed her, deep and sure, while the sun sank lower and painted the whole world in shades of gold and rose. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning with the sky so blue, It almost hurt to look at it. Caroline wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Margaret had helped her make, simple but elegant, with her mother's pearls at her throat. Rye wore a new suit that made him look almost uncomfortable, but his eyes, when he saw Caroline walking down the aisle of the little church, held such love that she felt her own eyes sting with happy tears. Margaret stood as witness, beaming with pride. Judge Martin performed the ceremony, his official capacity giving weight to the vows. Half the town attended, cramming into the small church and spilling out onto the steps. When Rye and Caroline exchanged their vows, speaking the words that bound them together, it felt nothing like her first wedding. This time, there was no doubt, no fear, only certainty and joy. "I promise to love you," Caroline said, her voice clear and strong. "To stand beside you, to build our life together, to be your partner in all things. I promise to be honest and true, to support you in hard times and celebrate with you in good ones. I promise to choose you every day for the rest of my life." "I promise to love you and protect you," Rye said, his hands holding her steady. "To respect your strength and support your dreams. I promise to be worthy of your trust, to make you laugh, to build a home with you where you always feel safe. I promise to be your friend, your partner, and your love from this day until my last day." When Judge Martin pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers. Rye kissed Caroline with enthusiasm, and they walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, into their new life. The reception was held at Margaret's boarding house, with tables set up in the backyard and food contributed by half the town. There was dancing and music, toasts and laughter, and a sense of celebration that went beyond just the marriage. It felt like the whole community was blessing this union, investing in this new family being formed. As the sun began to set, turning the sky pink and purple, Rye and Caroline slipped away from the party. They rode out to the ranch in a wagon decorated with ribbons and tin cans, accompanied by the whoops and hollers of their friends. When they arrived at the cabin, Rye lifted Caroline over the threshold, both of them laughing. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ryder," he said, setting her gently on her feet. "It's perfect," Caroline said, looking around at the cabin they would share. Rye had spent the previous week cleaning and decorating with Margaret's help. There were flowers on the table, a fire in the hearth, and everything neat and welcoming. That night, they began their marriage in truth, and Caroline discovered that love could be gentle and joyful and free from fear. Rye was patient and tender, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and when she cried, he held her and promised that he would spend every day showing her what love should truly feel like. The first winter of their marriage was hard work, but filled with happiness. They rose early to care for the horses, Caroline learning the rhythms of ranch life while Rye continued to build his breeding program. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, Caroline sewing or reading while Rye worked with leather or planned future improvements. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories and dreams. Margaret visited regularly, always bringing food and news from town. She watched her niece bloom with pride, seeing the fear fade from Caroline's eyes and replaced with contentment. "You're good for each other," she told them one snowy afternoon. "You balance each other out." By spring, the ranch was prospering. Rye's horses had earned a reputation for quality, and buyers came from as far as Colorado to see his stock. Caroline proved to have a natural way with the animals, particularly the nervous or skittish ones. She worked with them patiently, earning their trust, and Rye joked that she was the secret to his success. It was in May, nearly a year after they met, that Caroline realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but waited to be certain before telling Rye. When she finally shared the news one evening after dinner, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He whooped with joy, lifted her carefully, and spun her in a gentle circle, his face alight with wonder. "A baby," he kept saying. "We're having a baby." "We are," Caroline confirmed, laughing at his excitement. "In late fall, I think." Rye immediately became impossibly protective, insisting she rest more and do less heavy work. Caroline protested that she was perfectly healthy, but she secretly enjoyed his concern. It came from love, not control, and that made all the difference. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Margaret was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a gray tant and began knitting tiny clothes with determined enthusiasm. The neighbors brought advice and hand-me-down baby items. Rye built a cradle from smooth pine, carving delicate horses into the headboard. In early November, with the first snows beginning to fall, Caroline went into labor. Margaret and the doctor came to the ranch, and after a long night of hard work, Caroline delivered a healthy baby boy with her husband's blue eyes and a surprisingly loud cry. "He's perfect," Rye said, holding his son with the careful reverence of a new father. "He's absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas after Rye's father and called him Tommy. He was a good baby, healthy and curious, and watching Rye with their son made Caroline fall in love with her husband all over again. He was gentle and patient, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor at night when Tommy fussed, singing soft lullabies in his rough cowboy voice. The years passed in a blur of work and love and family. The ranch continued to grow, and Rye was able to buy additional land and expand his operations. Caroline managed the household and helped with the horses, and proved to have a good head for the business side of things as well. They made decisions together, true partners in every sense. Tommy grew into a rambunctious toddler who loved the horses as much as his parents did. When he was 3, Caroline gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after the aunt who had made everything possible. Maggie was calmer than her brother, with her mother's dark hair and a sweet, observant nature. Margaret the elder was now in her 60s, but showed no signs of slowing down. She sold the boarding house and moved into a small cottage near the ranch, declaring that she wanted to be close to her family. She spent her days helping with the children and tending a spectacular garden that provided vegetables for all of them. In 1883, Wyoming territory continued to grow and change. The railroad brought more settlers, towns sprang up seemingly overnight, and civilization crept steadily across what had once been wild land. But out at the Ryder Ranch, some things remained constant: the mountains in the distance, the grass rolling to the horizon, the horses in the corrals, and a love that had started with a chance meeting and grown into something unshakable. One evening in late summer, with Tommy and Maggie finally asleep and Margaret retired to her cottage, Rye and Caroline sat on their porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Caroline wore her wedding ring, the simple gold and diamond that Rye had given her on a hilltop at sunset, and she turned it absently as she leaned against her husband's shoulder. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Rye asked quietly. "If you had not gotten on that train, if I had not been at the station that day?" "Sometimes," Caroline admitted. "But not with regret. Everything I went through, as terrible as it was, led me here, to you, to our children, to this life. I would not change it." "You saved yourself," Rye said. "That's what I admire most about you, Caroline. You did not wait for someone to rescue you. You rescued yourself." "And then I found you," Caroline said, tilting her face up to kiss him. "Or you found me. Either way, we found each other." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower. The ring on Caroline's finger caught the light, sparkling the way it had that first time Rye slipped it on her hand. She had traded one wedding ring for freedom and received a better one that represented not ownership but partnership, not obligation but choice. Inside the cabin, a child stirred and called out. Caroline started to rise, but Rye placed a hand on her arm. I'll go. You stay and watch the sunset." He kissed her forehead and went inside, and Caroline heard his gentle voice soothing little Maggie back to sleep. She smiled and turned her attention back to the spectacular sky, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had left Boston with nothing but a carpetbag and determination. She had been terrified, alone, and uncertain of what lay ahead. But she had chosen to keep moving forward, to build a new life on her own terms. And in doing so, she had found not just safety and freedom, but love. Real, deep, abiding love with a man who treated her as an equal and a partner. The sunset faded to purple twilight, and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Rye came back out and resumed his seat beside her, pulling a blanket around them both against the evening chill. "All quiet?" Caroline asked. "All quiet. She just needed her father for a moment." They sat together under the emerging stars, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The ranch spread out around them, the product of their combined labor and dreams. Inside the cabin, their children slept safely. In the cottage beyond, Margaret was likely reading by lamplight, content in her old age to be surrounded by family. "I love you," Caroline said, simple words that carried the weight of everything she felt. "I love you too," Rye responded, pulling her closer. "Today, tomorrow, and forever." Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their family and their ranch. Tommy grew into a responsible young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, already talking about expanding the operation when he was old enough to take over. Maggie showed artistic talent, filling notebook after notebook with sketches of horses and landscapes. But she also had her mother's business sense and often helped with the accounting. In 1890, Wyoming achieved statehood, becoming the first state in the Union to grant women the right to vote. Caroline cast her ballot in the first election with pride, thinking about how far she had come from the frightened young woman who had fled Boston. She was now a respected member of her community, a successful rancher's wife, a mother, and a full citizen with a voice in her own governance. Margaret lived to see Wyoming become a state, expressing satisfaction that she had moved to such a forward-thinking territory all those years ago. She passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1892, at the age of 70, surrounded by the family she had helped create. They buried her on the ranch, in a spot overlooking the creek where wildflowers bloomed every spring. The loss was hard, but Caroline took comfort in knowing that Margaret had lived to see her happy, safe, and loved. The older woman's final words to Caroline had been, "You did well, my dear. You built a good life." As the years marched toward the turn of the century, the Ryder Ranch became one of the most successful horse breeding operations in the region. Rye's judgment about bloodlines and Caroline's skill with training created horses that were sought after throughout the West. They employed several ranch hands and had become prosperous beyond what either of them had imagined in those early days. But more than the success, more than the prosperity, it was the love that mattered. Rye and Caroline never lost the spark they had found that first day at the train station. They continued to work side by side, to make decisions together, to support and challenge each other. They had their disagreements, as all couples do, but they faced them as partners, always remembering that they were on the same team. On their 20th wedding anniversary in November of 1896, their children now grown, Rye took Caroline back to the hilltop where he had proposed. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning its descent, and the view was as spectacular as it had been 2 decades before. "Do you remember what I said here?" Rye asked, holding her hand as they stood looking out over the land they had built together. "Every word," Caroline said. "You said you wanted to give me a better ring, one that represented something true. And was it better?" Caroline looked down at the ring on her finger, worn smooth by 20 years of wear but still sparkling in the sunset light. Then she looked up at her husband, his face lined now with age and weather but his eyes still the same brilliant blue, still looking at her with the same love. "It was better," she said. "Not because of the ring itself, but because of everything it represented. You gave me a partnership, a family, a home, and a love I did not think existed. You gave me a life worth living, Rye. Every single day with you has been a gift." Rye pulled her close, and they stood together on that hilltop as the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson, painting the Wyoming sky in colors that seemed created just for this moment. The ring on Caroline's finger caught the light one more time, a small circle of gold that represented everything they had built together. She had traded her wedding ring for a train ticket west, desperate for freedom and hoping only for survival. Instead, she had found a cowboy who gave her a better ring at sunset, and with it, a love that would last a lifetime. It was more than she had dared to dream, more than she had thought possible, and exactly what she deserved. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Caroline Ryder knew that every difficult step of her journey had been worth it. She had found her home, her love, and her happily ever after, here in the Wild West where anything was possible for those brave enough to reach for it.